URI. There's a bunch of a bunch of headers which follow. They contain information about the message, such as the destination, the origin, and the route. And then there's a body, which is usually a description of how the media stream is supposed to be located. That'll use SDP, which we won't be talking about. Okay. So, start line. As I said, you basically have either a request or a response. This stuff should look fairly familiar to anyone who's done anything with HTTP. So the method-based request system, you basically send an invite, a buy, a register, or whatever, and that indicates what you want the message to do. So an invite creates a phone call, a buy would tear down a phone call, a register would register your location with a registrar. That's a mouthful. So register is used basically to inform other VoIP entities where you are, your specific IP address. Response messages, it's generally an error code or a status code of some sort, plus a reason. And you'll see that this smells like HTTP. So you'll get things like 404 not found and 403 forbidden. Headers, the important ones are basically the ones that are used for display information. So you've got a to URI, which basically says this message is supposed to go to someone. It should show up, but it's actually not used. In the start line, the method is followed by a URI, and that URI is what's actually used, not this one here, the to URI. The from is the URI that you want to have displayed as the originator of the phone call. Now, this is for display, right? So what you'll find is that even though these are only really intended for display, a lot of broken, and by broken I mean very commonly deployed telco kit, will use the to and the from for billing purposes. So you can bill to other people simply by editing this content. You can also avoid getting billed. You can also do spoofing. There's a large number of attacks you can do simply because the people who implement software look at to and from and think that that actually means the to and the from. What they're really looking for is this information here, the contacts header. The contacts header is used to say this is the specific location that you should be talking to. The contacts header is the critical one, right? So if you're going to be tested for authorization or authentication, it should be against this contact URI, not the from URI. But it's very infrequently that you'll find that. The max forwards, very simple time to live stuff. You can use it for trace route. And there's also very bad ideas that have been implemented, such as the alert info. So the alert info header basically supplies a URL for a file to be downloaded and played rather than a ringing sound on the remote system. So when you phone someone up, you can say, rather than playing like oldphone.wave, download and play Nigerian greeting.wave. And then you'll get someone saying, you know, dear sir or madam, I come to you in friendship. All right, the core infrastructure in voice over IP is this sort of generalized stuff. You basically have user agents or terminals. This is basically the soft phones or hard phones or voicemail systems or whatever. These are the things that actually place and receive phone calls. Okay, so these are just endpoints. Depending on what protocol you're talking about, you end up using different terms. But soft phone and hard phone is usually pretty much covers everything. Then you'll have proxies. Proxies are used to create a sort of a fixed entry and exit point to a voice over IP system. They're used to make sure that the internals of the system, of the voice over IP network, are not exposed directly on the internet. Conversely, they can also be used as great ways of doing, for instance, port scans behind. So a lot of proxies are actually very poorly configured and very poorly developed. And by sending them misformed SIP packets, you can tell them to attempt to connect to a large number of internal addresses on a large number of ports, and they will return error or success messages back to you. And you can use that to do port scanning through them. And they're also frequently set up so that they bypass firewalls. So they're great entry points into systems as well. There's also location servers. Location servers have different names. In SIP, they're called registrars, and in HTTP3, they're called gatekeepers. Essentially, the idea is that these things map an IP address, so your IP network address, to something that someone is going to try and call. So your URI, your Universal Resource Indicator, something like that. So if you have a bob@biloxi.com, it will go and it will track down where Bob has logged into and send a message to there. Right? So these things are great to target, particularly because they have a large amount of information and they play a very critical role in the actual working of voice over IP. And then finally, there's gateway boxes. There's both media and signaling gateways, and their role is simply to bridge two networks. So typically, that's going to be between the PSTN network and the IP network. And as I mentioned previously, these things are very good things to target if you're trying to get into the PSTN and, for instance, commit toll fraud and get free phone calls. Right? So that was a sprawling introduction to voice over IP. I'm going to look briefly at phreaking. So we'll look a little bit at the history of phreaking, the techniques, and then the death of phreaking. So historically, phreaking started in the 60s. It used to exploit in-band signaling. It relied very heavily on hardware-based attacks. And you'll see here's two famous phreaks. So Steve, and that might be Steve as well. There's also Captain Crunch, who I mentioned because he was here 2 years ago, and he'll never be here again. Yeah, so like basically, all of this phreaking stuff was loads of fun, and everyone was being happy and hippie and free love, and let's screw the phone systems or whatever. And then they found out that the phone system guys made a lot of money, and they didn't like that too much. The techniques that they used basically exploited one major security fuck-up. There was in-band signaling. So basically, all of the commands that you would send over a phone were sent over the same line as all of your voice data, which meant that it was sent as basically audio tones. So phreakers who had equipment to generate those audio tones could send commands. So like the classic one is 2600, which was used for blue boxing. All of this stuff was typically used for toll fraud, which is basically making phone calls without paying for them. Now, thanks to voice over IP, toll fraud like that is less interesting because everyone can make free phone calls anyway. Oh my God, that's terrible. Cool. Okay, so on the next slide, as you can see, this one's all pornography, so if we could just advance to the next one. Okay, and now a short interpretive dance. Okay, so this very blurry object over here is basically a very old school blue box. The one I had in high school didn't look like that. Okay, while they do that, let me tell you the one story I have about old school phreaking. So when I was in high school, I had someone make me a red box. Red box basically played, like, we had these really old payphones, right? And when you put in a quarter, like when you put money in, it would generate a series of tones that indicated that you put in 25 cents. So someone built a red box for me which generated the same tones. So you could go up to these payphones and you could hold the thing up to the mouthpiece and you just hit the button and it like registers that you're putting money in. So I decide to go and use this thing. I wander out and I find a box that's, it's old enough that I can actually exploit it. And I rock up and I make my long distance phone call to my friend. I put in like $5 at the beginning. I'm really cool. And about halfway through the conversation, an operator breaks in and says, "Sir, you're going to have to put in more money." So, being a smart phreaker, I hold my box up and I start hitting the button. And I hear, "Sir, sir, sir." I go, "Yeah, what is it?" She goes, "Sir, you have to put in real money." So red box just kind of died out. So now, unfortunately, we've had the death of phreaking. Basically, that came about because they now have out-of-band signaling, So all of the signaling stuff happens external to the voice data. So all of your audio content is separate from all of the stuff that says, I'm calling from this phone number, I'm trying to reach this other phone number, and so on. Also there was this, the very aggressive prosecution of phreakers. They basically, they tried to do cutting off the head attacks. They took all the people that knew what the fuck they were doing and threw them in jail. And so those of us that showed up didn't have anyone to learn from, like when the operator gets online, stop using your fucking red box. So they've also had improved fraud analysis techniques, or far more improved than Mac OS anyway. So the improved fraud analysis stuff basically means that they now automatically detect when people have made a large number of long distance phone calls and they still have no bill showing up. They've got stuff like that just to make sure that, like, even if they can't detect the technical attack that you're doing, they'll notice it when you're ripping them off, because that's actually all they care about. You can do all the technical shit you want as long as you pay them the money. Now, of course, we have the I'm not dead yet, I'm feeling better. So VoIP phreaking is allowing all of these guys who stopped breaking stuff because they didn't want to go to jail and they couldn't do it anymore. They now have a chance to get back in the game, and it's also given an opportunity for a whole bunch of other people to get into the phreaking game, which is all very exciting. So we're going to look at VoIP phreaking briefly. So we're going to look at some of the motivations, an overview of attacks, and some of the techniques. Now, fair warning, the agenda might not in any way actually mirror the content of the slides. Okay, so we've got hackers who basically enjoy exploring new technology. That's what they say. What they actually mean is they want to get rid of finding a bug. Right? There's a lot of cool stuff that you can do, but given the cost of technology and so on these days, you can do most of it in your room with an old Linux box. So going out and exploring the PSTN doesn't make a huge amount of sense unless you're trying to get rich in the process. There's also a bunch of guys who are now returning to the PSTN after they got kicked out in the 90s. So they weren't allowed to go and do all of these attacks, and they had to move onto the internet and do like fucking web hacking and so on, which they found very boring. And now they've got a chance to get back in and start screwing the telcos again. And of course, we've got a large number of people who are now just trying to make a buck. This is one of the things we're going to focus on a little bit more towards the end of the presentation when we start looking at phishing attacks and how voice over IP makes phishing attacks far more dangerous. Okay, so here is an overview of a large number of different attacks. So we've got media attacks. So as we were talking about in the functionality realm, you've got all of the media content that's getting passed between two endpoints. There's any number of attacks you can do on that. Obviously, the two interesting ones are eavesdropping, which is where you can copy the media content, you can monitor the media content and see what's going on, so you can listen to other people's phone calls. And there's injection, where you can actually add content to the media stuff that's going through. So you can take a media stream and replace portions of it with your own content. We'll be talking about that in the context of phishing, but it could be interesting in, say, contract negotiations. If you know that it's you versus someone else going for a contract, you could inject what you'd want him to say to the HR people, which might make his phone call interview go very poorly. Signaling attacks, there's basically, there's a lot more than I've listed up here, but there's hijacking attacks, which we'll look at a bit more in depth. Hijacking is basically taking over someone else's phone number. So, thanks to voice over IP, you can no longer assume that when you dial someone's phone number, you will actually get that person, which is great. So hijacking is going to be cool stuff. Rerouting is basically where you can reroute phone calls or reroute the signaling path to include, say, a third party. There's also obviously eavesdropping attacks that you can do at this layer, so you can force yourself to be added to conversations and so on. PSTN attacks. You can also do hijacking at the PSTN layer. I've ignored denial of service because I have to admit that I find denial of service stuff very, very boring. Obviously, you can DOS any of these layers, but why would you want to? Like stopping Aunt Millie from talking to her nephew is very uninteresting. Phoning Aunt Millie and telling her that I'm her bank and I need her PIN number, that is interesting. Right?